Hi, my name is Lisa Butler. Welcome to the overview and recommendations for the East San Joaquin Groundwater Working Group Stakeholder Assessment. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires that stakeholders are involved. That means that groundwater users get to help plan for and preserve their shared natural resources. Groundwater sustainability agencies are required to prepare an interested parties list, and they must also consider the ideas of groundwater users in planning and in the preparation of a groundwater sustainability plan. You might be wondering, what in the heck is a stakeholder assessment? Well, the assessment is a tool that helps us to discern the who, what, where, when, and why of stakeholder engagement. We're trying to find out what people need in order to be successful in participating in deliberative processes. We also want to know if there are any problems, opportunities that could be available to us in the deliberations, things that require stakeholder concurrence, preferred ways of communicating, and preferred planning approaches. This is a little bit more about this particular assessment. Early on in the process, the East San Joaquin Groundwater Authority and its advisory committee determined it would be important to include stakeholders in the process. As part of that, they convened a working group to help them sort through a number of the issues. In that process, though, there were some glitches. Some different members of the group were not completely convinced that the process was working. That caused the staff to make a request to the California Department of Water Resources to see if they could get some facilitation assistance. With that, the facilitator decided that it might be helpful to do a situation assessment or a stakeholder assessment. The first step in the process was to actually ask the group if they'd be interested in it. So they were invited to participate. Altogether, that involved 23 invitations. The interviews were conducted in fall of 2018. It included 17 questions, and altogether 17 participants were involved in the interviews. So what happened? Well, all of the folks were interviewed, and the results were divided into two parts. The first part was content, and the second part was the process. Related to the content, the group had a number of really good ideas, and we encourage you to read the memo that we provided separately. Some of the highlights were that they wanted to have better data transparency and more data, period. They were also concerned about land use and how that might affect trade-offs. They wanted to make sure there was still system flexibility, the ability to do adaptive management, and they had some questions about governance. Related to the process, the group did have a number of concerns. The first had to do with the way that the group was convened. There was some confusion about the roles and responsibilities of the group. They didn't really completely understand how what they were doing was going to relate to the overall planning process, and they weren't sure who exactly was going to be receiving their work products. They also wanted to know what their work products should be. They really were looking for a lot more definition about that. The group felt that they really had a lot to offer, and they wanted to make sure that their skills were being leveraged. And getting back to governance, how does their work relate to the overall big picture? How are decisions going to be made? As mentioned before, the group itself had a number of great ideas and recommendations. Those have been included in the memo that we previously provided. We'd encourage you to look at that, and we'd also let you know that a lot of the ideas are ones that we probably would have recommended. We also take a look at projects and facilitation outreach efforts from the standpoint of project management risks. As you can imagine, just getting out there and talking to people inherently involves things that could go wrong. So one of the things we do is look at what the risks are. Then we talk about what potential adjustments might be that would allow you to have a process with less risk and more success. In evaluating or measuring project risk, we're considering a number of different things. One of the first things that we look at is the actual design of the process. Are there good technical measures, good quality, and what kind of performance measures have been designed? We also want to understand how well the project's being managed. Are all the classic features that we know lead to success in place? Organizational and internal issues are also important. The external features, like what's happening with litigation or politics, matter. And the historical features, the things that the group has done in the past related to collaboration and engagement. Thinking about the technical design, one of the very first things that we're going to be looking at is how realistic are the goals, the scope, and the objective. In this case, a lot of effort and thought was put into what scope should be used. People realized that it wasn't going to be possible to have 100% of people involved all of the time. So there was a thoughtful design that scaled things in ways that could be better managed. Overall, we found that the goals, scope, and objectives were realistic and that they were very consistent with what might be expected for facilitation, outreach, and engagement best practices. The next item we look at is project management. Has outreach and engagement been fully incorporated into the design of the project? Do we see it in the project management plans? Does everything hang together? Another thing we want to understand is how well it's being deployed. What does the execution look like? One big deal item is change management. A lot of things can go wrong here, and we have to remember how significant the change is. Finally, how are time and resources being allocated? This project is challenging because of Sigma and the timelines that have been put in front of us. We don't have a lot of choices. So it's doing more with less, and that's a pretty big deal. The next thing that we look at is the organizational culture or internal features that are going to drive what happens with the project. Projects of this size can really have a lot of impact on organizations. According to project management literature, executive sponsorship is one of the biggest factors in whether or not a project will be successful. The executive sponsor champions the project. They make sure it receives proper guidance and proper resources. The elected officials of the Groundwater Authority, as well as county executives, have demonstrated a commitment to successful implementation of Sigma that includes making sure that stakeholders are involved. From an outreach and engagement perspective, proper prioritization of stakeholder activities can be a problem, particularly when you're looking at such a difficult technical issue such as Sigma and the Sigma requirements. In thinking about implementation of the Sigma requirements, something we have to remember is that this is occurring in the face of all of the other work that the San Joaquin County staff has to do. It's hard to give priority to stakeholders when none of your other work has gone away. Another organizational factor that we look at is distribution of workload. The Groundwater Authority is going to have to rely heavily on consultants to help them achieve requirements. Even when the consultants are highly capable, as certainly is the case in the East San Joaquin Basin, stakeholders have an expectation that they're going to be interacting with the actual decision makers. The next review category involves external factors. From an outreach and engagement perspective, these external factors are going to be pretty challenging. As an example, the legal and regulatory features of Sigma are changing even as we speak. It can be difficult for an agency to engage stakeholders when there's so much that's so unsettled. It can be difficult to keep stakeholders engaged when they know that a political or some other activity could cause priorities to change. The last category that we look at is historical. A key predictor of how well a collaborative process is going to work is how well the last collaborative process worked. We want to take a look at the experience this group and groups like it have had with similar projects. Along the same lines, we're also looking at organizational relationships with stakeholders. For the East San Joaquin Basin, both of these factors are pretty good. There's a long history of the basin stakeholders working together to solve problems and manage water. One factor that's going to be a little bit harder to manage is policy and data adequacy. Because Sigma is new, there's just a lot we don't know, and that's going to increase project management risks. The last area of concern is stakeholder and media fatigue. This is also an issue in the East San Joaquin subbasin. The reality is there's just a lot going on, a lot of different things that require stakeholder attention, and a lot of controversies. It's hard to keep track, and people do get tired. At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, all that's pretty interesting, but what does it mean, and what is it we're supposed to do with it? As a reminder, the purpose of a risk assessment is to identify the kinds of things that actually could go wrong, and then figure out if they could be prevented or at a minimum be mitigated. Part of the good news for this assessment was we found a lot that was going right, a lot of things that probably weren't going to be a problem. For example, the technical quality and performance measures are all pretty good, and the project management design was pretty solid. That said, there were a couple of areas that might benefit from a little bit more attention. The first one was organizational and internal. The reality is, working with stakeholders does take time, even if, and we do know this, not working with stakeholders will take more time in the long run. That said, the staff are already really busy, and the consultant team is rightly focused on technical issues. The other thing to remember is that stakeholders expect that they are going to have a chance to talk to decision makers. The recommended action here is to go back and evaluate project plans in light of the time required for stakeholder interactions. You should also look at those plans to ensure that the time for staff interaction is properly resourced. The next focus area is external factors. You might remember this had to do with the regulatory and legal environment. This is a highly fluid situation, so for this factor, our recommendation is just to make sure that expectations have been set with stakeholders and that they know that things could change as the situation changes. The last category was historical. Most of the things that we measured in this area were actually pretty positive. The one red flag was policy and data adequacy. This is an area of concern. Stakeholders have a lot of expectations. So similar to other recommendations, we want to make sure that people fully understand what the data context is, what can be done, and what has been done already. The next set of recommendations relates to the assessment findings on content that stakeholders have suggested be used for groundwater sustainability planning. Rather than evaluate the merits of any particular proposal, the facilitation recommendations discuss how the content provided by stakeholders should be used. For example, the stakeholders have asked a number of questions about the planning process and data that will be used to populate the plan. In this case, those questions can be translated and provided as part of frequently asked questions handouts or other project communications. Other types of input can be used to generate planning criteria and/or implementation measures for the planning process. Stakeholder input can also be used in the development of decision criteria and performance measures. So as a recap, in this assessment, we considered three basic things: risk management, planning content, and the last thing we're going to talk about, which is the process. Related to the process, the stakeholders really did have quite a few comments about concerns they had. The good news here is nearly all of the stakeholder concerns can be addressed through the use of good group chartering practices. The first practice involves the chartering body. The chartering body should have a really strong idea about what they need from a group. The roles and responsibilities of the group should be well defined, And that's kind of up to the chartering body to set the stage for that. It's perfectly okay to negotiate a little bit with the group, but overall, the group is working on behalf and at the request of the chartering body. The second practice is setting a clear mission and establishing strong goals for a group. A group needs to know what it's expected to deliver and why and how its outcomes are going to be used. A group should also be given a sense of how their work is going to relate to other work associated with the project. Also, how important it is, the relative value of the contributions that they're going to be making. The next best practice is bounded timeframes. What that means is a group should have a beginning and an end, a specific time frame in which they are to do their work. This is true even if the process is going to be ongoing or you expect a standing committee. In that case, you would want to have group members be given terms so that your membership can be refreshed. And you can also take a look at the work that needs to be done and ensure that you have the right people at the table. The next item is membership responsibilities. This is as simple as things like attendance, any expected homework, ground rules. One important item, though, that a chartering body might want to include is the obligation of group members to ensure their own stakeholders are being informed, particularly when the stakeholder body is a representative group. Another best practice is charter language related to decision-making. It's very important that the decision-making process is outlined before deliberations begin. To the extent that a chartering body does need or want a consensus product, guidance should be given to the group. Otherwise, groups typically are allowed to decide for themselves what their decision-making process would be. That wraps up the overview of the assessment findings. Thanks for spending the last 17 minutes with us. My name's Lisa Butler. You're welcome to give me a holler if you'd like to have more information. We hope you have a great day.